In today's video, I'm going to be going over a barbell squat and the moment arms within the ranges of motion in both a high bar and a low bar squat and how this can affect our training. So if we look at this slide, we've got our shortened position, the mid-range, and the lengthened range. Okay. This line right here represents the line of force of the barbell. This green represents the hip joint, and the red represents the knee joint. Now, the squat is a compound movement, so our hip, the muscles at our hip, and the muscles at our knee are both involved in this movement. So we can draw moment arms to figure out which muscles at which joint are working the hardest. Now, in the shortened range here, we can see that these moment arms are extremely small. And the reason being is this line of force is practically stacked with the joints here at my hip and at my knee. So I'm producing very little force, if any, in this position. And this is universal. Everyone's biomechanics are different. The length of my femurs are different than the length of yours. The length of my torso is also different than the length of yours. Now, in a high bar squat, I have to lean slightly forward. As you can see down here, I'm leaning a little bit because of the way that my biomechanics are set up. If I don't lean slightly forward, then I won't be able to get down in this depth without something in my kinetic chain here being out of whack, leading to incorrect form. Okay. Now, if we look at the mid-range, we can see in a high bar squat, in this mid-range, the muscles at my hip joint are working the hardest. The muscles at my hip joint are producing the most amount of torque. Now, even though this moment arm is small here at my knee, my quads are still working. Okay. But for me, a high bar squat is more of a hip dominant exercise, as you can very clearly see here. So the muscles at my hip, my glutes, are going to be getting the most benefit out of this exercise. That's not to say that my quads are not working. That's not to say that I'm not getting any stimulus with my quads here. But for me and the way I'm set up, I am producing the most amount of force at my hip. If we look here in the lengthened position, this moment arm gets even larger, which is why a squat feels so hard at the bottom. And this is also why you'll see a lot of people stop here in this mid-range. So people will start here, obviously, in a squat. They'll get down to this mid-range, and this is where everything hits the fan. This is where you start producing high amounts of force. This is where the exercise is hard. It's not the hardest, because we can see the lengthened range is the hardest here, but this is where things start getting hard, and this is where people will bail. So 9 times out of 10, you won't see people getting to this kind of depth if they're lifting correctly and not using their ego, not loading multiple plates on the bar, picking fights with weights that they can't handle. You'll rarely see people get down into the hole like this, because this is where things get hard. This is where you start producing the most amount of force. Remember, the longer the moment arm, the more force you're producing. The more force you're producing, the harder the exercise is in that range. Now that we know which ranges of motion are the most difficult, thanks to the use of moment arms within a high bar squat, we can use this information and see if a barbell squat is an efficient exercise for our physiology. And what I mean by that is the length-tension relationship here. If you're not familiar with this, check out the previous video where I go a little bit more in depth into what this is. But basically, in the shortened position, physiologically, our muscles are capable of producing the least amount of force. We are the weakest in the shortened range. Does that match up with the shortened range in a high bar squat? For me, yes, it does. Moment arms are small. We're producing very little force, if any. Here in the mid-range, physiologically, we are capable of producing high amounts of force. Does this match up in the mid-range of a high bar squat? For me, yes, it does. I'm producing a high amount of force in this mid-range at my hip. Those two match up. In the lengthen range here, we are also capable of producing high amounts of force. We are strong in this position. Does the resistance profile of this high bar squat match what we are physiologically capable of producing with the length tension relationship here? Yes, it does, because this moment arm is very large, which means I am producing the most amount of torque in this exercise. I am capable of producing the most amount of torque in that lengthened position. And that we have this information here with moment arms, and we know which portions of the high bar squat are the most difficult, how can we use this information to maximize our training and to train more efficiently? Well, we know that the lengthen range and the mid range are the two hardest points in this exercise. So what do we want to do? We want to spend more time in the hardest points of this exercise, because we're producing high amounts of force in these two positions. We're producing very little force, if any, here in the shortened range. Okay, so you don't want to avoid getting deep down into the hole just because it's hard. We know it's hard. We want to try to get there. Okay, we want to maximize our strength gains. If we want to maximize our strength gains, we need to get down into these two positions. Now, in terms of injury prevention, again, we know this lengthen range and this mid range are the two hardest points in the exercise. So you really want to make sure that your form is tight, that your form is crisp once you get down into these two positions. Because if you start to cheat, you let something slip in your kinetic chain here, the chances for injury go up. Whereas up here, I mean, how are you going to really cheat just standing up straight with a bar, right? So now we're going to look at a low bar squat. The previous demonstration was a high bar, and a low bar is exactly what the title entails. The bar is just slightly lower on your back. So I didn't record me doing a low bar squat. So instead, this 5 right here is going to be our barbell. So we've got 5 pounds on our back that we're squatting. It's a lot of weight there. It's a lot of pressure. So moving the bar slightly lower on your back does change things quite a bit. We can see in the shortened position, the moment arm to my knee is actually slightly larger because it's farther away from my knee joint. Obviously, that's what moment arms are, right? We look here at the mid-range of a high bar squat was more hip dominant. The mid-range for a low bar squat for me is pretty even between this hip joint and the knee joint. Okay, so my quads are producing high amounts of force, and my glutes are producing high amounts of force here with the low bar. Then once we get down into the lengthened position here, again, we got our line of force and our barbell still pretty even. We're producing a little bit more force with the muscles at the hip, but we're producing more force with our quads compared to this high bar. We're not producing a whole lot there. So if I wanted to shift the focus of a hip dominant squat to a knee dominant squat, for me, in the way that I'm set up, I would do a low bar. So if I wanted a little bit more stimulus for my quads in a free weight squat, I would simply go to low bar. This is why, because I'm producing more torque down here in this lengthen range, and this moment arm is reflecting that. And then again, if we look at the length tension relationship, we're weak in the short, strong in the mid, strong in the lengthened. What are we doing down here in this low bar squat? We're producing high amounts of torque in the lengthened, where we are the strongest, producing high amount of torque in the mid, where we are the strongest, And in this shortened range, we're producing very little force, if any, where we are physiologically the weakest. So if I wanted to maximize both the muscles at my hip, the muscles at my knee, I should probably be doing a low bar squat. All my life, I've done high bar. It just feels better for me. I feel more comfortable. I can nail my form down a little bit more with a high bar, and it makes sense as to why my posterior chain is a little bit bigger than my anterior, because I've done high bar all my life. High bar for me is hip dominant. So if I did incorporate a free weight squat into my routine in the future, and I wanted to get more stimulus for my quads or whatever the case, I would switch to low bar.